Steam has become a dumpster fire, a flaming brigade of trash that requires time spent sifting to be able to find the gold at the bottom. Not everyone has the time to look through and determine what's bad and what's good, but that's what I'm here for. Today, I'm going to sift through the muck so that you don't have to. We'll be taking a look at some of the worst reviewed games on Steam. I picked 10 games that were among the mixed, negative, and overwhelmingly negatives. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to once again talk about bad games. Before we get into the games, I'd once again like to talk about how I chose the games on this list. I chose the working backwards method again, ranking all of the games on Steam by their rating and starting from the bottom of that list. We could just talk about Overwatch 2, NBA 2K24, and Modern Warfare 2, but that wouldn't make for an interesting video. Because of this, I decided to curate a list of games from different genres. I once again tried to pick out games that weren't just psychological horror or builder games, because those populate quite a lot of the lowest rankings. I also made an effort to pick games that not a lot of people have talked about yet. Of course, there are some games on this list that are well known, but most of them are hidden travesties. My final note is in regards to how I approached the reviews for each of these games. I will not be going into a deep dive for each entry, I will just be giving my impressions and providing some brief background. I did play each of the games on the list though, and tried to play any tangential games that I felt were important for context. I also have tried to be as fair and impartial as I possibly can with each entry. I tried to find the positives about each game instead of just bashing on every single entry on this list. Of course, if there are any downsides, I'll be sure to point them out. With that, let's get into the games. Knights of Pen and Paper 3 is a game that I was both excited to see on this list and saddened by its presence. This is because I'm actually incredibly familiar with this series and quite fond of it. Knights of Pen and Paper was one of the first ever games that I played on my PC. Back when all I had was a shitty laptop set up on a wooden card table with a barely functioning discount gaming mouse, I couldn't really afford to buy or run every new AAA game. So I had to find the smaller projects, the cheaper ones, the games that I could actually play on my PC. Knights of Pen and Paper was one of those games that I had stumbled across. I fell in love with this game from the get-go. The simple premise is that you control a party of adventurers. Well, not really adventurers, but they're playing heroes in their tabletop role-playing campaign. Your party sits at a table while the dungeon master crafts new battles and adventures to go on. You have a small part in crafting these battles as well, actually choosing what enemies and how many are present in most of the encounters. The game itself functions like a basic RPG. We can create our characters, choose our classes, and head off into the world. Battles aren't that in-depth, and each class only has 4 abilities, with a base trait for each character, adjusting your playstyles slightly. We can equip trinkets to provide some more upgrades and customization, but the whole thing doesn't really go that deep. It's simple enough to pick up and play, but we can min-max the thing to achieve some astounding results. The character of the game is what I was really drawn to as a kid, though. The first project was all very tongue-in-cheek, referencing the game itself constantly and parodying the TRPG genre. As a kid who had just started playing Dungeons & Dragons, this game was kind of a dream. I did play through the entire series just to refresh myself on where things went, especially so that I could have some context on where the third game ended up. The first game still holds up pretty well, though there is a lot of grinding involved to try and progress. The character of the game mostly shines and is probably the part that sticks out the most. I really liked being able to customize the table with little trinkets that would provide permanent upgrades for the party. The first game in the series was developed by Behold Studios and was published by Paradox Interactive. The second game, though, would be given to a different developer, Kai Games. There isn't a ton to say about the second game because it's a lot like the first. It mainly provides the systems with quality of life upgrades, improved art style, better menus, upgraded navigation. It's a pretty great improvement overall, though I do think the game feels a bit dated today. This isn't really because of systems or mechanics, but mostly because the second entry doubled down on the character a bit. The game goes a bit over the top with the tongue-in-cheek pop culture references, and that isn't really my thing. The third game in the series would see the games returning to Behold Studios, this time with themselves publishing. Galaxy of Pen and Paper would be mostly the same setup, but seeing your party now playing a sci-fi tabletop role-playing game instead of a fantasy one. In general, the game does return to form in most ways. The references are slightly toned down and a little less overt, feeling more in tune with the game that we were playing at first. The combat systems are still simple to pick up, but there's added features like a traversable world map, more types of side missions, and a better focus on creating missions. We can actually choose how quests will turn out in this entry, playing both the DM and the characters. The skill system has some slight downgrades though, with leveling just being reduced to base stat upgrades and letting us choose new skills at certain levels. All of this brings us to the most recent entry in the series, and the one that ended up on this list, Knights of Pen and Paper 3. This would see the game going back into the hands of Kai Games and publisher Paradox Arc returning. Now, before we talk about the bad, I just briefly want to talk about the things that this game gets right. First of all, this game does come with a few quality of life upgrades, the biggest of which is adding party members to your game earlier. In the first few entries, you would start with 2 to 3 people at your table, and as you progressed, you would get enough currency to unlock new ones, but this usually came at a point where your party was already leveled up quite a bit. This means that you now have to grind to get those level 1 characters to not be one-shotted as soon as you enter battle. Knights of Pen and Paper 3 gives you 5 party members pretty early on, so they all stay pretty consistent with each other. You can change them out later for new ones, so if you choose to do this, then you're going to be left grinding. This was a nice change overall though, because it prevents players from being forced to kill tons of enemies, slowing down the game in general. The game also has improved graphics, which could be seen as a positive or a negative. Sure, there's some new lighting on the sprites and the fidelity is improved overall, but the game ends up looking a bit generic. This one comes down to preference. Personally, I think it looks all right outside of the bland copy and paste text for the dialogue boxes. Now that the short list of improvements is out of the way, we can talk about what Knights of Pen and Paper 3 does wrong. First of all, the game has totally shirked its previous structure for one of a bland mobile game. We now have a town with multiple buildings that can be upgraded to increase weapon damage, blessings, etc. Now, because I was playing the PC version, there weren't any microtransactions, but the mobile version of the game does have them. This sort of makes sense because the first game started out on mobile. The PC release only came after the popularity that game saw. So I guess in that sense it was only a matter of time before the series went down this route. The other problem with this game is the insane grinding to get to any sort of reasonable upgrade. Leveling has been completely changed. Each level just increases base stats, and the only way to increase skills is to get skill books, either from drops or from quest completions. The game also has no enemy variety whatsoever. For the first hour or two of the game, we fight the same exact enemies over and over again. It becomes so monotonous and bland. It also takes forever to go anywhere in the game. We spend so much time just running back and forth from village to forest to village to forest again and again. This is because this has entirely become a mobile game. It's not even trying to be something cool with its own style built around a simple RPG. It's this complete bastardization of the previous games in the series. One of the worst parts of the game is that the style has been completely taken away. The tongue-in-cheek humor has gone fully overboard off the side of the ship. The game is now about goblins and esports or something. It's really cringy and just has no tact whatsoever. Knights of Pen and Paper 3 took a quirky little series, one that definitely had its faults and was made for a specific type of person, and turned it into a monetization machine with no soul and no heart. The first few games definitely didn't have it all figured out, but at least they felt genuine. This just feels gross. The next game on our list is called My Riding Stables, Your Horse Breeding, but the breeding has a lowercase first letter. This game was developed by Mark Technic, or Independent Arts Software. I'm not entirely sure because it seems like their name was changed at some point. Regardless, they develop a lot of games. They have 54 games listed on Steam, most of them just complete shovelware, and a lot of them about horses. This game specifically is like the lightest version of Stardew Valley that you could imagine, but with horses. Our goal is to take care of our horses, keep them happy, and upgrade our facilities. The game is really simple though, and just doesn't have a ton for us to do. We can brush our horses and clean their hooves. We can also take them riding around the fields to try and increase their skills. The main way to earn money is through competing or by training foals in our stables. This is a mini game that I could never get the hang of. You're supposed to lead the horse into different checkpoints and make them stop. It's supposed to be difficult to order them around because they're still being trained, and you can offset this by using carrots. But the real problem comes with the controls, which just make no sense whatsoever. You can't even seem to get the horse to switch tracks, and the game doesn't make it very clear where the checkpoints even are. You just end up fumbling around with the thing until you eventually fail. This is one of the largest problems with the game in general. The controls are just a huge mess. Walking around on its own feels like driving a car. Moving with the thumbsticks relies working on an axis that the sticks are split across. If we push down, then we immediately start backing up, and turning the stick to the side will have us reversing like we're trying to parallel park a Corolla. None of it's intuitive at all. It's borderline frustrating just to try and make your way around this small plot of land. The game does have some other features that sort of turn it into a Stardew Valley-like that's focused around horses. We can harvest carrots from the land and buy skill books online, as well as upgrade the buildings around the area. But in most ways, this game just fails at being a compelling simulation project. I've put a ton of hours into Stardew Valley and games like it. When they're done well, the gameplay loops can be satisfying, addicting, and incredibly compelling. So I'm definitely not opposed to something like this, but here it just isn't really finished at all. There's a lot of work to be done, and judging by the developer's previous catalog, this is just a cash-in to try and get some more money. DGU Death God University is a game developed by DSK Studios, a developer that I couldn't find much about online. They don't seem to have much of a presence, and it doesn't seem like they did anything at all after this game was released. DGU is a really strange and honestly kind of charming game in a few ways. The game sees us playing a devil-like guy that's just joined the Death God University. This is seemingly a school where people can go to learn the arts of killing. Our goal is to help our teachers out by taking on different tasks, neutralizing some of the other attendees of the school. These other students are usually running on some sort of rampage, messing up classes, and/or just hindering the teachers in some way. Each of them is some sort of pop culture reference, like the first mission being to take out Bulk, an obvious reference to the big green guy. This is probably my least favorite part of the game. I think referencing movies and famous characters is really low-hanging fruit, and just generally exhibits laziness on the part of the writers. It's completely of its era though, considering this game came out in 2015 and was released in a time when this could completely fly. The gameplay and the way that we actually take these guys out is by solving little puzzles to incapacitate them. Taking out Bulk requires us to create a jetpack out of equipment we pick up around the base, and then trap him in glue so that his shoes fly off. This causes him to crash through the ground. We are graded on each assignment, and getting a better grade is done by stealing our necessary equipment without being seen. Each time we're noticed taking something that isn't ours, we get a negative mark. The whole project is pretty simple and doesn't require a lot on the part of the player other than trying to figure out the puzzles at hand. Judging by the Steam reviews at the time of release, the game suffered from tons of performance issues, crashes, dropped frames, etc., but a lot of those issues seem to have been fixed, or at least I didn't experience any during my time with the game. The style of the game is actually pretty great when it isn't biting on the heels of pop culture. The art style is unique to its time, and the environments fit with the world that it's trying to develop. The music is simple but complementary. Wrapping things up on DGU, I don't really think it's that bad. It's definitely not the best thing I've played, and certainly isn't my style. If you like these sort of tongue-in-cheek reference games and love solving little puzzles, then this actually might be for you. At the end of the day, I don't really think it's deserving of the rating it has at this point. It's not a masterpiece, but I know that there's a crowd out there that would enjoy this. Hacker.exe was developed by Link Up Games. It's described as a horror strategy puzzle game, which I guess it kind of is. Now, I'm not going to harp on this game a ton because it seems like it was sort of a passion project. It's also pretty cheap, only costing $9 total, but the game itself is not good. There are many computer-based horror games, specifically entries like Welcome to the Game immediately come to mind, but Hacker.exe is a very low-end version of that. First off, the tutorial for the game almost immediately breaks, causing you to have to figure out most of it through tips in the computer's files or just through pressing random buttons. It took me forever to even figure out what I was supposed to do or how to even use the PC itself. Your goal is to hack sites and then send packages to your contacts. While you're doing this, you have to keep your VPN going, otherwise someone will take control of your machine. The process of actually beginning a hack requires us to retrieve website links and IPs and then copy them into a program. The whole design of the game is really ugly. The game looks thrown together and there isn't a lot here that's inspired or original, though that is to be kind of expected from a first-time, assumingly single developer. Even the little hacking programs just look like something you could throw together in Aseprite. The hacking minigame is also incredibly convoluted. We have to send out specific programs in a little tower defense game. Each program will take out a specific tower, and then after the way is cleared, we can send out our hack to complete the process. This whole thing is just incredibly slow though. It takes forever for our programs to travel along the track and get to the towers. We also don't know which part of this is actually going to work, so we can end up sitting waiting for our programs to reach the towers only to have them get destroyed, and then send out another wave of new ones. It's just incredibly tedious. These programs also cost money, which we can get by using a crypto miner that's installed on the computer. If we run out of programs, we have to wait for this without any other way to get money outside of hacking. The whole thing is an alright idea, but one that's been executed much better in other circumstances. I do like games in this genre, and I think if you like this sort of thing, I'd recommend something like Attachment Not Found, a short horror narrative that takes place on a computer made by Final Girl Games. Also, it's free. Link Up Games did seem to release a demo for another game on Steam called Ultimate Reality in 2020, but the demo appears to have been removed at this point, so I can't be sure whether this dev will return to making games or not. Chinese Train Trip is one of the most aptly titled games I've ever seen, because this game is exactly what it says, a Chinese train trip. It was developed by Mona Vista, who is known for games like Russian Train Trip, Russian Train Trip 2, Train Travel Simulator, and Plime. Clearly, this developer has found a niche and is playing to it. The game we're playing today is incredibly simple. We start in a Chinese town, we can buy a ticket for a train and board that train. The train then takes us to our destination, and that's about it. I did make an effort to inspect all of the details of the train before I quickly realized that each cab car was exactly the same. Girl laying down, girl sitting to the left, guy laying down, couple talking, guys talking, two people laying down, two girls sitting, conductor. Girl laying down, girl sitting to the left, guy laying down, couple talking, guys talking, two people laying down, two girls sitting, conductor. Oh my god, I'm in a nightmare. We can talk to some of the people on the train, but most of them are pretty rude and speak to us in very broken English. We can tell a bored girl a story and then say, "Have a good road." In all honesty, I can see the comforting appeal of a game like this. I know that people love the cozy aspect of a lot of these simulators, and sure, is it nice and warm to look out the window and watch as the snowy landscape passes outside? There is something comforting about the sound of the train car rumbling over the tracks beneath us. But in the end, the assets from the game are just reused over and over again. There's really nothing inspiring here, anything useful or original. It's just a game to cash in on whatever success Train Travel Simulator had. It's definitely not worth checking out unless you really need to simulate the same cab car over and over again. Skull Island: Rise of Kong is a game that has come under a lot of flack recently, and probably for good reason. I noticed this game on the upcoming schedule a few weeks before it came out, and when it released, people obviously noticed that it was a huge flop. Poor design, bad graphics, the game just seemed like a licensed project that was pulled straight out of the early 2000s. Skull Island was developed by a studio called Iguana-B. They don't have the best track record. Their first release was called Head Snatchers, a party game that a lot of people seem to like, but most noted as generally sluggish and clunky. They then went on to release their first licensed title, G.I. Joe Operation Blackout. Most were a little harsher on this entry, claiming that the gameplay was boring. Most complaints were just that it was unpolished and wasn't really worth your time. They also released Little League World Series Baseball 2022. This was the time that they started working with Game Mill Entertainment, a publisher noted for just churning out trash. Most Steam reviews call this one of the worst games that people have ever played, and a project that does a disservice to baseball games. Their final game before working on Skull Island was a game called What Lies in the Multiverse, which was much better received. It got good reviews from multiple publications, good Steam reviews with overall minimal complaints. It should be noted though that Iguana-B only assisted on this game, so that makes their one positive mark only really a half credit. This brings us to Skull Island: Rise of Kong, a game clearly based around the very famous character. The game is obviously supposed to resemble the Skull Island film released in 2017, but it isn't really clear whether this game exists in that same universe or whether this was just a one-off deal. Judging by the reception, I would assume the retrospective decision would favor the latter. The game itself begins with us playing one of the Kongs. As we reach our first boss battle, though, we are quickly killed by a beast named Kaw. Only one Kong survives the assault, and this is the character that we play moving forward. The game is a very simple action-adventure. We control Kong running around a pseudo sort of open world. We can fight the various species on Skull Island with simple and heavy attacks. We can use finishers, throw objects, and have a rage meter. Considering that the combat is supposed to be the main part of this game, it's incredibly simple and boring. It's about as bland as it gets, especially in 2023. The game just doesn't offer really anything in terms of variety. We can upgrade our skills over time, but this is done very slowly. This is where one of the largest problems with Skull Island comes into play. The game is just boring. There's nothing here that screams ingenuity, no reason for the game to stick out. It honestly feels like a licensed game that would have been released on the PS2 or the PS3. Just focusing on the gameplay alone, it's just nothing. As the gaming landscape has evolved and changed, developers have figured out new ways to make old formulas interesting, new mechanics and ingenious design choices that change the way we play the same bare bones. We may just be jumping around with a character, finding our way through environments and fighting bosses, but one of the biggest challenges of creating a game in general is finding innovation, different paths to what is ultimately the same goal. This is something that Skull Island doesn't seem to have even tried to navigate. They just created a bland action-adventure system and slapped a property onto it. At least some licensed games give you two reasons to play them: a property you might be interested in, and some new mechanics that fit that character and world. Skull Island is just a property you might be interested in. They seemingly forgot to include the second part. The other obvious complaint is the graphics and style of this game, something that people online have been very vocal about since the game's release. Now, I don't think the game looks laughably bad. It's not so awful that it's hilarious. It suffers from the same issue as the gameplay. It's just bland. This is where I come to my final point with this game. Most of the hate and publicity came from still images of Skull Island, Rise of Kong. Now, I'm not saying the game isn't bad, it is, and I definitely wouldn't recommend buying it, especially with people complaining about crashes and poor performance, but the game isn't this so bad it's good masterpiece. It's just a boring, uninspired cash-in. If you buy this even to laugh at it, you will not have a good time. It isn't worth that. It just sucks. Legends of Persia was developed by Serena Game Studios. Serena is both a publisher and a developer, though. They haven't really been responsible for anything notable, but Legends of Persia sure is an ambitious project. At its core, it's a simple ARPG. It clearly takes inspiration from games like Diablo, Path of Exile, and Grim Dawn. Click to move, build a character, set up skills, all the systems that we know and love from these types of games. I also want to preface this section by saying that I'm incredibly prone to dumping tons of hours into ARPGs. I got sucked into Lost Ark. I have an embarrassing amount of hours on Path of Exile. I stick to these games like the police stuck those charges to my grandfather for collecting rainwater in his own damn backyard. That being said, these games aren't easy to get right. There's a lot that goes into them. Good movement, skills with actual feedback, and most importantly, balance. These games are a juggling act, and that isn't to say that every game doesn't have complications in development, but this genre is incredibly difficult to get right. Legends of Persia doesn't seem to understand how to pull these things off. The first thing that strikes me about this game is the style. It's very bland, character models are boring, UI looks thrown together, and the environments just look rough. That being said, the game was released in 2014, so there's some leeway there, but it doesn't forgive the tone. On top of that, the game runs incredibly poor. Even menu transitions take forever to complete, and you're just left waiting for something to fade in on the screen. The initial loading screens took so long that I actually thought the game had just crashed. I decided to give it like 5 more minutes just to see if I was wrong, and it kept going and going before I realized that it was just that poorly optimized. The combat is also really poorly done. There's not a good variety of skills, leaving us with little option to move forward. This makes fighting incredibly uninteresting and devoid of life. The animations for combat just look awful. Half the time I couldn't really tell what was going on because there were just so many sparkles happening and my character was enveloped in a field of bright colors. The loot and gear never felt like it had any real impact. My character rarely ever felt like they were growing stronger. Even the first boss was just a ridiculous projectile sponge. I got to the point where I had to just kite it around the arena, stopping every few seconds to fire off a shot with my bow and then running away some more. This became an incredibly tedious affair that took way too long. It wasn't challenging because the boss couldn't actually kill me if I just kept running away. The one positive I can give this is the effort that has gone into the narrative. I don't think it's particularly astounding as a tale on its own, but almost everything here has a cutscene. Most of the cutscenes don't look particularly impressive, but it seems like this was a big focusing point for them. You have to respect that they seemed like they were actually trying here, but in the end it just doesn't really work out. In the end, I can't exactly recommend the game, mostly because it's just not worth your time or money, unless you really need another ARPG to play and you've run out of all options. I won't talk too long about this entry because it's basically the definition of cashing in on a trend. If you've been paying attention at all to video games this past year, then you probably heard the name Only Up. This was an indie game developed by SCKR Games. It was a platforming game that required you to move about platforms, only going up. This game became incredibly popular with streamers because of the difficult nature of the project. If you fell from an incredibly high platform, this would often require you to lose a good chunk of progress. For obvious reasons, lots of people tuned in to watch streamers lose their cool when being set back for hours in the game. The game had its own message about overcoming yourself and resonated with a lot of players. In 2023, the game was removed from Steam by the creator for reasons of personal stress. At the time, the developer was receiving a lot of hate because of accusations around using stolen assets in the game. The game also received some criticism around the fact that the idea was pretty similar to another game called Getting Over It. The game was also accused of being an NFT advertising scam because there were NFTs plastered all over it. But this section of the video isn't about Only Up, at least not the original. It's about a game that came after the original was removed from the store. If you search Only Up on Steam right now, you'll see a ton of clones that have come to pick up all of the leftover cash on the ground after the original left the storefront. Only Up 2, Only Up Girl, Only Up with Friends, Only Up Rising. There are tons of these games, but the one I'm going to talk about today is literally just titled Only Up. It's by far the most blatant because it didn't even try to make you think it was distinct from the original. It is literally just attempting to try and mislead customers into buying this game, believing that it's the removed one. The whole project becomes even worse once you realize that the whole thing is just an incredibly horrendous version of Only Up. Now, I'm not trying to say that Only Up was some masterpiece that deserves the best legacy. From the brief amount of research that I did, it seems like the game stole assets and then made a ton of money off of them, at the very least. This is not even accounting for the fact that it was pretty heavily parroting some ideas from previous games like it, but I've seen a lot of people try to pass off the clones because the first game was a ripoff, so who cares, right?
I don't think it's made by the same devs. I think it's just people who saw the success of Only Up and wanted to cash in, which honestly I'm down for because I kind of like playing these games. And also the people who made Only Up aren't the most good people in the world. They stole most of their assets to make the game.
No. Just because the game flipped assets and was low effort doesn't mean that every game trying to be like it should be able to as well. This is simply justification to try and find a new revenue stream after the first game was removed from the store. This game is god-awful and a shadow of the original game. It uses the most basic objects for platforms and looks like something you would play on a phone. On top of that, the game is actually split up into levels. This means that each time we reach a helipad, which happens incredibly often, we get to restart from that point. If we fall, we just start back at the most recent helipad. This completely removes any of the challenge that the original game had. This clone is actually very easy, mostly because of the checkpoint system, but also because you can pick up loot crates along the way that will give you power-ups. These can be used to skip over massive chunks of the level. This game literally has nothing going for it. It is soulless. It is a cash grab ripoff of a ripoff. It's the bottom of the barrel with absolutely no redeeming qualities. I did actually try to get into the online mode, but the game blatantly lies about how many people are online. I couldn't join a match at all, and the all-time peak for this game is 72 players, when the game claimed that there were 307 players online. This is just horrible, god-awful trash. Don't buy. Revolution 60 is a very odd game. It was developed by Giant Space Cat, a company started by Brianna Wu, a woman known for podcasting, blogging, failed attempts at Congress, and her connections to Gamergate, and I'm not touching that subject with a 10-foot fucking pole. This was Space Cat's first game and was actually released for iOS in 2014, but was then remastered and released on Windows in 2016. The game was originally meant to be a turn-based strategy game, but after Wu saw Infinity Blade, she decided to change it into a 3D project. The game was described during development as Heavy Rain meets Mass Effect, and the art style was heavily inspired by Space Channel 5 and Sailor Moon. The PC port of the game even had its own Kickstarter with a goal of $5,000, and the final number of money brought in totaling $12,728. Now, I'll be honest, I don't even know how to begin talking about this game, because I have no idea what it truly is. The Heavy Rain meets Mass Effect descriptor is honestly sort of close, but in all the worst ways. The game revolves around a group of women spies called Chessboard. Political tensions have grown between the US and China, and the group eventually has to travel onto a space station that functions as a orbital weapons platform. This event could become political pretty quickly, but the group's goal is to shut down the onboard AI to prevent a massive catastrophe. The first thing we should probably talk about is gameplay. Revolution 60 has many different ways to play it: mini-games, pseudo-turn-based combat sections, and typing challenges. It's a very weird combination of gameplay that just never meshes together at all. There's really no cohesion here, and some parts feel like a really bad phone game, while other parts feel like a really bad educational game that you'd be forced to play in elementary school. The mini-games will have us pressing the spacebar quickly, pressing directional keys quickly, timing spacebar presses, etc., etc. They're incredibly simple, and it's clear this was developed for mobile first. It probably worked much better there, but here it just feels very low effort. There are certain sections during action sequences or combat that will require us to type words that relate to what our character is doing. This is easily the most out-of-the-nowhere void part of the gameplay. It feels incredibly lazy and uninspired. This could have just been not included. They could have just had the character do the action and it would have been better. The game would be much better off with it removed entirely. And that brings us to the combat, which is both far too easy to have any sort of challenge, while also being incredibly frustrating. The whole thing happens in real time, so we can attack as soon as our abilities cool down, and so can the enemy. We have 8 squares we can travel across using the directional keys. When we're in the same lane as our enemy, we can attack, but they can sidestep these attacks. Once we build up our energy meter, we can do a finishing attack, which is where we have to test our typing abilities to pull off the special move. The enemy can attack us as well, and we have to avoid these attacks by moving around the squares. First off, the whole thing just feels incredibly goofy. Moving up and down and waiting for the enemy to attack, firing off shots at the enemy and chasing them around the board, watching the whole scene from another perspective just looks very strange. On top of this, every time we shoot an enemy, it stuns them for a second. This means that a lot of the time we can actually just stun lock enemies and take them out very easily. There's no challenge involved whatsoever, because we can just take out every enemy with incredible simplicity. We can choose skills as we level up, but the skill tree is very simple. There's not a lot of choices here, and every upgrade that we get just makes the game that much easier, which again removes any challenge that exists in the combat. The final large bursting red sore thumb of this game is the presentation. Obviously you can see it for yourself, but I cannot overstate how ugly this game is. Every single thing about it is just something I don't like. The character models all look awful, with this very strange choice of every character having basically the same face with some very loud differences. Each character has like a color theme and a specific dress that really sets them apart, I guess, but they're all just so bright and lack any sort of subtlety. It screams sitting around at a table and going, what if one of them wore a checkerboard pattern and she had antennas? That could be like her thing. It's just so awful. Speaking of color, this is one of the loudest games I have ever seen. There is not a single shot in this game that doesn't have 10 clashing colors in it. I get it. The developers wanted a distinct style here, but it's very clear they didn't understand anything about how colors complement each other on screen. Just gross, ugly, bright neon on every single surface, including the characters themselves, which clash against the backgrounds. The voice acting also isn't the greatest. It doesn't feel like anybody was really giving it their full effort here. This whole thing is just a massively misguided attempt at making an interesting narrative. We will have choices throughout the game that will affect the story, but good luck if you think you're making it through the end of this thing. What is a game that I almost didn't include on this list? The main reason is that it's basically a dumb, goofy troll game, but I actually had a little bit more fun with it than I expected to. That doesn't really mean that I think it's worth it or a good game, but it surprised me slightly with its style. The game was developed by Foxy and is honestly no better described than by its own Steam description. Today is Saturday, and the grandson came to visit Bill. Bill and his grandson decided to fry potatoes for lunch, but there were too many potatoes, so they decided to treat people on the street, and at the same time, broadcast. The game is exactly what it sounds like. We start out as Bill, an old man streamer, I guess. He has a skillet full of fried potatoes and can try to feed them to people throughout town. The goal is to get a high score and feed as many potatoes to the civilians of this town as you can. The game seems to take a lot of inspiration from games like Postal, and in that it gives us a lot of freedom to run around and mess with things. It's definitely not as deep as something like Postal 2, which is one of the biggest downsides to the project. We can interact with some objects, buy some guns, drive a big wheel around town, and of course, feed people potatoes. But people don't exactly like being fed potatoes, and they will get angry if we're too pushy with our delicious food. But that's okay, because I always keep an iron on my hip. In the end, there really isn't a lot of super deep things to say about What, because there's not a lot to do. We can play around with some things and have some fun, but it's really only worth an hour or two of your time. That being said, it's not the worst thing in the world. If the game had a couple upgrades, adding some more items, more interactivity, more variety, and most importantly, some graphics fixes and optimization, then I think there'd be something worth checking out here. With that, we've completed another 10 negatively reviewed games on Steam. I just want to say again, thanks for watching this series. I love doing these short little videos in between the longer projects. I'm hard at work on the first Witcher video, which is growing in word count by the day, but you'll definitely be seeing that soon. With that being said, if you have any particularly terrible games that I should check out on Steam, put them in the comments below and I'll try to feature it in the next video. Bye, Dad.